Welcome back to our discussion of different ethical systems. We're examining utilitarianism, and in this video we're going to be taking a look at the strengths and weaknesses associated with utilitarianism. So if we consider the strengths of utilitarianism, what we can see is that it has a very strong absolute core principle. The core principle of utilitarianism is basically to do what promotes the most utility, to do what promotes the maximum good for the maximum amount of people. And therefore, in that way, utilitarianism has very clear outlines, provide or promote human flourishing and reduce human pain and suffering. And therefore, the strength of utilitarianism is that it provides guidance for actions of prosperity. Still, utilitarianism has some weaknesses. There are some criticisms of the view of utilitarianism. We have very clear goals. We have a very clear outcome in mind in practicing utilitarianism, in that we want to promote the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. But then what is the priority? How do we calculate that? We don't have one of those hedonic calculators that I mentioned in the previous video. Which is the priority? To do a higher level of happiness for few people or a lower level of happiness for many more people? And so if we have a unit of happiness, do we kind of condense it all in and provide that to a small number of individuals with lots and lots of happiness? Or do we take that happiness and dilute it out? Do we spread it out and give it to a whole variety of people by giving everybody a little bit of happiness as opposed to a few people a lot of happiness? Another criticism of utilitarianism is attempting to compare the consequence. Is something absolutely right, or is it objectively right? Something that is absolutely right is going to be the best actual consequence that can occur in a given situation. But then we get back to that problem that how do you foresee the outcome of an action? The absolute rightness, the absolute outcome can only be determined after the act. And it's kind of hard to undo an act after it's already been done. In contrast to that absolute right that can only be determined after that action has occurred, we can have objective rights. So in order for an action to be objectively right, you need to be able to reasonably expect it to be able to give you kind of the desired outcome, to give the best possible outcome under these circumstances. A further criticism of utilitarianism is a criticism of comparing the consequences. Basically saying, what are those long-term consequences of our actions? You may have heard of the chaos theory. And so a butterfly flapping its wings in Brazil causing, an outcome in the world, miles away, continents away. And so if we are going to be practicing utilitarianism, how do we determine what are those short-term outcomes versus these long-term outcomes? Because these consequences could potentially go on into infinity. They could have an effect much, much greater than what we're able to foresee. And therefore, a criticism of utilitarianism is that it's impossible to accurately determine what is the ultimate outcome of the consequences of our action. We can maybe be able to see what happens kind of in the immediate outcome, but we don't see what happens kind of at that long-term outcome by having the rippling effects of our actions. So as I mentioned on that earlier slide, there are two types of consequences. The first consequence is going to be the absolute or the actual consequence of the act, and the actual consequence of the act is going to be referred to as the absolute right, or the absolutely right action to occur. And so as I described previously, again, that's the action that is going to give you that best actual consequence. Now, the problem with that is that it can only be determined after that action has occurred. Now, the alternative to the absolute right is going to be an action that is going to be objectively right to do. And so consequences that are reasonably to occur given the situation. And so objectively right is going to be that action that is reasonably expected to give you the best consequence. Now, in reality, there are probably going to be more than two of the kinds of consequences. We've got the absolute consequence, the absolute rightness of an act giving you that best outcome, but it can only be determined after the action has occurred, versus the objective outcome saying, do the best that you can based on those circumstances. But in reality, and again, going to that criticism, there are going to be an infinite set of possible acts and an infinite set of consequences. And those consequences are going to continue on. And so we may see the immediate effects of our action, but there are going to be unintended consequences that can kind of reverberate throughout the world and potentially come back towards us. And so are we morally responsible for the unintended consequences of our actions? So these criticisms of utilitarianism basically give rise to an application of utilitarianism within the realm of situationalism. Now, with situationalism, this is basically a view that there are going to be different applications of the rules in different situations. Now, the goal is to be as objective as possible, so be able to apply these rules in these different situations in the same way that other individuals are going to be applying to them. And so objective as opposed to subjective. Subjective is, I'm going to act in the way that I think is best under these circumstances, as opposed to the way that the majority of people would be acting under these circumstances. And so this idea then is that we're going to apply this utility principle to the specific situation. And so this is, again, a situationalist argument as opposed to a relativist argument. Remember and review the other videos on ethical relativism if this is not familiar. In ethical relativism, we're looking at an application because of a different individual or group. We're looking at situationalism because we are looking at applying these ethics based on a given situation, as opposed to relativism acting in a specific cultural setting or group dynamic. Okay, so to kind of finish up our view of utilitarianism, we basically question, do the ends justify immoral means? And so we've said, if we're focused in on this teleological, consequentialistic view of ethics, focused in on the outcome, if it's a good outcome, is it okay to have an immoral means or an immoral act to get there? Now, we've seen that utilitarianism has a level of rules that can apply to it, but we could extend another level of rules as well, this utilitarian doctrine of negative responsibility. And so we are responsible for the evil that we commit and for the evil that we knowingly allow. But sometimes we may have to do the lesser of evils in order to have that desired outcome to occur. And so, in this argument, the utilitarian doctrine of negative responsibility is basically kind of focused on kind of the ideal outcome, but recognizing that the action should be that which minimizes the evil, minimizes the bad, or minimizes the harm that associates with that. And so it's not just solely getting the best outcome, it's going to be getting the best outcome with the least amount of damage, the least amount of evil or harm that could be occurring. Okay, so thank you for listening to this second video on the ethical theory of utilitarianism. As always, if you have any questions, please do not hesitate to reach out to me. Thank you and have a great week.